Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm LT and today we're going to be spending just a little bit more quality time with the ugly truck, my 2000 Chevy Silverado. Now, if you're just tuning in, here's kind of the basic story. I picked this truck up back in January and it had 325,000 miles on it. The thing was wore out. And my whole goal is to kind of make a several stage build where I ultimately end up with a high power race style of build, but I'm going to start out doing just kind of a budget build. And that's kind of where we're at right now. I started out by going through the whole chassis, rebuilding everything, front suspension, rear suspension, lowered it down, upgraded the brakes. I re-geared it and then I swapped the 4L60 to a 4L80 using all junkyard parts. Now the truck is running and driving great. The only thing I don't like about it right now is it's much too quiet. So today we're going to work on the exhaust. I wanted to keep a budget in mind for this exhaust, so basically I didn't want to go out and buy an expensive cat back. Number one, they're very expensive, and number two, they're not going to flow enough to support my final horsepower goal. But I did have some scraps left over from my LMM Duramax, so I figured what better way to build an exhaust than repurpose some material that I already have. Which means this truck is getting a single 4-inch custom built exhaust. Now, you might think that's a little bit overkill, and you're probably right now, but that's okay because remember, I want to have this thing putting out 1,000 horsepower someday, and I want this to be the only custom exhaust that I'm building. So my process is kind of simple. I start with kind of some of the bends and just cut them up into their basic components, whether they're 45, 30, 90 degree bend, or what have you. And then I made a spot to hang the muffler. I kind of got some work done ahead of time, and then I just built a tailpipe. It kind of goes up and over the axle and down, and it dumps out right in the corner of the receiver hitch. Everything right now is just temporarily tacked together with a MIG welder. So my game plan right now is to get everything fully welded in with the TIG, hang the muffler, hang the tailpipe, mount everything permanently, and then I'll show you guys my sort of build technique as I connect the mid-pipe to the cats. I'm not going to claim to be the world's best TIG welder, but I think the results here speak for themselves. It's a nice, clean looking tailpipe assembly that, number one, and most importantly, will support the airflow goals that this engine, or some engine, is ultimately going to have. But number two, it clears everything on this modified truck. It has lowered suspension, but the 4-inch tailpipe nicely clears between the axle and the bed floor, fits around the rear suspension cross member and everything else, so there's no interference. The only thing I have left to do now is get this thing and the muffler fitted back underneath the truck, and then I can design the mid-pipe. So I've got the mid-pipe for the exhaust basically finished up, and you might notice I built it in two separate sections. The back half, which goes from the muffler and kind of jogs around the cross member for the carrier bearing, and the front half, which jogs back to the inside of the frame and has the factory 2-bolt flange on it where it connects to the catalytic converters. Now, I finished welded the back half and the front half before I put them underneath the truck and held everything in place to tack weld it together. That way I know everything's going to line up perfectly with the muffler and the catalytic converter flange. But you might have noticed that I used a MIG welder to tack the two together underneath the truck because it's going to be pretty difficult to lay on your back, have one foot on the pedal, have a torch and filler in each hand, and then hold the pipes where you want them to make it tack weld. So I usually use a MIG in a situation like that. However, I do have mild steel filler wire loaded up into the MIG, and this is stainless steel, and I don't want to allow the two to stay together. Now, yeah, sure, mild steel TIG, or MIG wire rather, will weld together a system like this no problem. It'll just have potential for corrosion, which I don't want to leave in there. So I'll just come through later on with a flap wheel, 80 grit, and I'll just smooth down as much of the tack weld as I can to eliminate most of the mild steel filler. Then I'll come back in with a 309 filler with a TIG and just kind of weld right over the top of it, and minimizing most of the chances of corrosion from happening. All I've got to do is finish up this one weld and the system is done, and we're ready to put it back underneath the truck. So it occurred to me as I was waiting for this pipe to cool down that I didn't actually tell you guys the process that I used to build an exhaust in the first place. Now, this is one of my absolute favorite things to do on any vehicle that I own, building a custom exhaust. And I use the same technique when I'm using anything else that's made from tube, whether it's an intercooler tubing, charge pipe, turbo intakes, and so on. First of all, I start with Mandrel bent tubing. Basically what that means is the diameter of the bend is consistent all the way through. You can go to a muffler shop and have a custom system bent up, but most muffler shops don't actually have a Mandrel bender, and as a result the diameter of the tubing actually gets a fair amount smaller as it goes through the bend, which will restrict flow to some extent. Now, if you're building a high performance system, you want to have the same diameter all the way through to kind of maintain flow. Now, when you get a box of Mandrel bends, you're just going to have 90s, 180s, 45s, and so on, but oftentimes you'll need, a 32 or a 77 degree bend, and you have to cut up the bends. That's kind of what they're for, and then piece them together and weld the whole system front to back. Now, first of all, you want to make sure you cut your bends kind of in line with the radius. I've got a scrap here. This is not cut in line with the radius, and as you can imagine, when you go to connect it to a round piece of pipe, it's not going to match up very well. As you can see, there's a really big gap on the end. So instead, when you cut it square, basically you have a perfect circle that'll match up evenly. Now, my process basically involves holding pieces up about 2 bends at a time. I'll make a mark and I'll tack weld them together. But that can be a little bit difficult when you're working under a truck with 2 or especially 3 pieces. So one thing that I found that makes life a little bit easier, some good old-fashioned hard styrofoam. This is basically a 4-inch plug, and what I'll do, kind of jam it into the pipe and put the bend in there. And it just holds everything nice and neat and square so you can make your mark and have everything line up. This is especially helpful when you've got a couple pieces lined up one to the other. Then welding. I never really do any welding underneath the truck except to make a couple of tacks to hold everything together, kind of like I did with both halves of this middle section of the exhaust. I always do all the finish welding over on the bench just because it's difficult under the truck to kind of get, well, first of all the way around the tubing, and second of all, easy access, especially if you don't have a lift like I do not. So those are my basic steps that I take, and you can build any exhaust system on any vehicle. I don't care if it's front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, if you've got an ATV, a side by side, you're building turbo piping, what have you. You can use these steps to build any tubing to get gas from one end to the other. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and kind of help this channel grow a little. Until next time, I want to say enjoy the sound of this exhaust.